Okay, friends. So again, our speaker this morning is Joseph Black from Mobile, Alabama. He's going to be delivering the talk, "Will You Be a Survivor of the Last Days?" Brother Black.
Well, it certainly is nice to be with everyone today. I wish we could really be there. As I was preparing this talk, though, and I've been talking back and forth with Ned every once in a while and talking about family, I think about years ago when I was in a little town at Eastern Tennessee, a small congregation, and there were 7 in my family. My father wasn't in the truth, and my mom would make us sit right down front, and whoever was the most misbehaving had to sit beside her. So usually that was me. That's kind of one of the things Ned and I have in common. And at this point in time, this brother was coming to give a talk, and he got up to give his talk. And he stated the theme of his talk in the form of a question, much like our theme today: will you be a survivor of the last days? Well, I raised my hand. I was going to comment because we were competitive. Who could answer the most? And my mom reached over and put my hand down, and I kind of looked at her like, well, I don't understand. So she leaned over and whispered, and she said, "That's a rhetorical question." Well, I was 8 years old. I don't know what rhetorical question means. So after a minute, I asked her, what's that rhetorical question? She said, "Well, that's a question that he doesn't expect anybody to answer." So I thought for a minute in my 8-year-old brain, and I finally leaned over and said, "Well, why did he ask it?" So today we're going to think about this. It's not a rhetorical question for you and I to think about. It's more of a reflective question. It's something that we really have to weigh very carefully. Because you see, I've given this talk a number of times. The society has adjusted the outline, and I was looking back at some of the older outlines. But one of the common threads that goes through this theme is a sense of urgency. And that's what we're going to convey today. We think about our last 2 watchtowers, the King of the North, the King of the South. We think about the programs, the updates we're getting from the society, how we're being spiritually fed. And I think everyone can kind of see this sense of urgency. They're talking using terms like imminent. They're talking about not only last days, but the last of the last days. So what we really want to do today is to weigh this question and reflect on it as individuals, regardless of how long we've been serving Jehovah, because we really want to not only know that we're living in the last days, but this will motivate us and our families and those that we're able to witness to. So that's what we're really going to focus on today, because we have to be concerned about any type of pending disaster so we can be properly prepared for it. As Jehovah's people, I can see many of you, you've probably been in the truth for many, many years. Maybe you've got grandparents, parents in the truth, and you're very fortunate indeed. And you probably think like I do, boy, we've been talking about the last days forever. I can remember growing up, and as a smart aleck teenager, my mom talking about the last days, and she didn't think I would ever get married, she'd ever have grandchildren or great-grandchildren. But now I'm the one talking to young people and talking to my son about how close we are to the end of this system of things. So that's the question we want to raise today. Do you and I really have enough proof? Do we have enough evidence that we are living in the last days? But most importantly, from a personal perspective, how can I survive the end of this system of things? Well, let's take a look there at our theme scripture. It was part of our song, Zephaniah 2:3, if you turn there with me. That's Zephaniah chapter 2, verse 3. And it tells us there, "Seek Jehovah, all you meek ones of the earth, who observe his righteous decrees. Seek righteousness, seek meekness." Well, sounds so far so good, but now it says, "Probably you will be concealed on the day of Jehovah's anger." And that causes us to pause, doesn't it? That probably, or the word that it's really talking about there, it may be that. Does that mean that it's just left up to fate, left up to chance? Well, no, because we want to look at another scripture and gain Jehovah's viewpoint, and it really gives us a lot of confidence if we look at 2 Peter 3:9. This tells us how Jehovah feels about his human creation, indeed about life in general, not only for us, but for those people that desperately need to hear about this. In 2 Peter 3:9, it says, "Jehovah's not slow respecting concerning his promise, as some people consider slowness, but he is patient with you, because he does not desire anyone to be destroyed, but desires all to attain to repentance." So we see how Jehovah feels about this matter. We know he's the giver of life. The gift that he holds out is everlasting life. But we're going to talk about 2 particular issues that you and I want to think about as we consider this question. What can we practically do to prepare and position ourselves right now for survival? And then how does our trust and our faith in Jehovah apply right now and on into the future? You know, you've probably heard the old cliche, those that don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And we know we're fortunate as Jehovah's people to recognize that everything Jehovah has recorded in the scriptures is indeed for our benefit. We can learn from these things. They're not just so-called Bible stories, are they? So we want to take you back. And, you know, we've been encouraged whenever we're listening to an audio recording, watching a video, our personal reading, to meditate on these things. The brothers have used the terms like to smell it, to feel it, to taste it, to make it come alive. So I encourage you to do that today as we want to take a trip back to the very first century there. And we're going to see the things that Jesus had spoke about in 32, 33 CE as he pointed forward to what was going to happen there in Jerusalem. If we could have that picture maybe posted to kind of give us a really feel for what it would have been like to live in Jerusalem. So we take a look here, and you just I want you to imagine for a minute that you're there with your family. This is a beautiful city. It's the center of true worship. How proud you would have been. Maybe you've been living there for generations. Something that would indeed be spectacular as you looked out each day at the temple, at that gold dome, so to speak, elevated above everything else around you. But now I want you to think a minute. Imagine that you're a Christian. You're living there with your family, maybe with your parents, maybe with your children. But as we get into 63, 64, 65 C, there's been a lot that's happening around you. And this beautiful city, this paradisaic city, the center of true worship, instead of becoming something to be favored and looked upon, it's going to become more of a prison because a lot has been happening around you. The Jews have revolted. They've slaughtered the Romans there in Jerusalem. They've asserted their independence against Rome. Well, what happened? Well, history confirms that Jesus had told them there was a fulfillment of this prophecy and it was going to take place there in the first century. Right after this revolt, history tells us that the Roman army under Cestius Gallus, the 12th Legion came in 66 CE. After this revolt, within 90 days, 30,000 troops appeared on that scene. 30,000 troops surrounding this city. They'd even undermined one of the walls. But then what happened? Well, they withdrew for some reason. They started marching toward the sea. But Jesus had spoke about this in Luke 21, 20 through 22. So let's take a look there at Luke chapter 21. And notice what Jesus had told them, and this was written many, many years earlier. That's Luke 21, and we'll look at verses 20 through 22. However, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by encamped armies, then know that the desolating of her is drawn near. Then let those in Judea begin fleeing to the mountains. Let those in the midst of her leave, and let those in the countryside not enter into her. Because these are days for the meting out of justice, in order that all these things written may be fulfilled. Now, did you notice there in verse 21 that Jesus spoke of the city being surrounded, but he said, let those flee? Do you recall the drama that we had, Walk by Faith, Not by Sight, many years ago? Wonderful, one of the last ones that we actually enacted before these beautiful videos that we've got. Maybe you recall what had happened there. It was such a well-done drama because it gave us such a contrast. You had two young men raised in the truth, so to speak, married in the truth, went into business. One of them started a family. And of course, we know the story and what happened there. What does history tell us happened? Well, we know in 70 CE, the Romans returned. They devastated, they destroyed Jerusalem. There were over 1.1 million lives lost in that slaughter. But you know what's interesting? Those ones that acted in faith and followed Jesus' words and actually fled and got outside of the city, it preserved their life because they acted in faith, but also they had to be obedient. It's really a special note that if you and I lived back then, hopefully we would have acted. We would have been faithful. We would have fled the city. Well, what if we decided that we didn't want to go all the way to Pella? We didn't want to go to a Gentile city. Maybe we wanted to go to a cousin's or an uncle's or an aunt's place. We would be able to stay there. It'd be just as safe, wouldn't it? Well, history tells us that when the Roman army came back, they destroyed over 1,000 towns and villages on their way back. So we've seen from their lesson, not only do they have to act in faith, but they had to be obedient and follow directions specifically. Because you see, those that heard Jesus' prophecy, they had ample proof. Jesus had spoke these words 3 decades earlier. They had abundant evidence as we saw these things happening around them. the Roman armies, the city surrounded, and then, unbeknownst to them, beyond human thinking, the Roman armies left. So those faithful ones took action. Yes, they had to make changes. We know exactly what happened there as we review that drama. That one couple were so desperate to gather all their things, to take their things, they were sure they were going to come back to their normal way of life. We see exactly what happened to them today. So what we want to review, though, is to take a look at what Jesus said about that at Luke 19, 43 and 44. That's Luke chapter 19. Let's consider verses 43 and 44. He was speaking here of those that did not act in faith and obediently, because the days will come upon you when your enemies will build around you a fortification of pointed stakes, will encircle you and besiege you from every side. They will dash you and your children within you to the ground. They will not leave a stone upon a stone in you, because you did not discern the time of your being inspected. So you see here, they lack discernment. They lack faith to act on this. So the question you and I want to ask as we review this historical account, do any of Jesus' words back there as part of this prophecy, do they carry on into our day? Is he giving us indications of in what sense we might see this encircling? We might have an opportunity to flee from this system. How would we go about that? Is it geographically, or is it other changes that we would need to make? Because you see, this prophecy about the conclusion of system of things, it actually applies to us today in a major way. It's true that history proves that the account there detailed at Matthew 24, verses 4 through 22, we don't have time to go into all of it today, but it did have an initial fulfillment back there from 33 CE to 70 CE. But if we recall that prophecy, Jesus had given it a greater global fulfillment. And that's taken place since the establishment of God's kingdom in the heavens. You might recall there in verses 26 and 28, Jesus said this would be the greatest tribulation that ever will be visited upon mankind. Well, it was a terrible tragedy, but it certainly didn't compare with World War I, World War II, with the over 100 million lives lost in warfare. Also, the prophecy Jesus said would affect all nations. Well, at that point in time, it only affected the Jewish system of things, didn't it? So we can take this prophecy, Matthew 24, we can take a look at another well-known, and we can contrast them and compare them and see how they build a case for each other. In Revelation chapter 6, you might recall, that's the account of the ride of the four horsemen. Well, we certainly see that around us today, don't we? But it's important when we think about what had happened there in Revelation chapter 6 to help us appreciate this, is Jesus was crowned as king at that point in time. He certainly wasn't crowned back in the first century. So again, just further evidence that we can glean so much from this prophecy. It's not just a history lesson, but it's what's befalling upon us today. Because we realize that that book of Revelation, if you recount, was written some 25 years after these accounts took place there in Jerusalem. So we keep that in mind, that we have an agreement between Matthew 24 and Revelation 6. And it really proves that this would be a future fulfillment. So we've got so much evidence, the Bible, the history, and then we just take a look around us that any thinking person has to see these momentous things that are happening. Indeed, this major fulfillment is starting to happen right now. I have further proof that we're living in the last days from other books of the Bible. Another prophecy about this last days is found at 2 Timothy 3. That's one that we well know, but let's take a look there at 2 Timothy 3. And there we read at verse 1, but know this, that in the last days, critical times, hard to deal with, will be here. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, haughty, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, disloyal, having no natural affection, not open to any agreement. And we'll stop there because it starts getting more and more negative, doesn't it, as we look at it. But what we really want to appreciate at these critical times, Paul was describing over 19 things that were accounted here in this prophecy. But he was describing more the actions and the attitudes that we would see around people, rather than things that would happen as they did in the first century. And we see the prevalence of these things today. So he wasn't really referring to the last stages of the Jewish system of things. Paul's prophecy applies, and we can see it around us today. You know, it's interesting how fortunate we are, though, as Jehovah's people, because it's very, very clear to us. One of our watchtowers had this to say: with so much evidence that God's kingdom is already established in the heavens, Why do the majority of people not accept what this means? Why are they not able to connect the dots, so to speak, between the state of world and specific Bible prophecies that our people, God's people, have been publicizing for many years? Could it be that most people are focusing attention on just what they see with their eyes? Does that preoccupation with human affairs blind them to what God is doing? Are some of them distracted by the noise of satanic propaganda? Especially we think about that. Do they focus only with their eyes, as we mentioned? We see with eyes of faith. We see what's happening beyond the physical, don't we? What a precious gift we have to be taught by Jehovah, how we can survive the end of this system and how close we are to the end of this system. But it takes more than just knowledge. It takes faith, and it takes a spiritual perception to see what's happening in the spirit realm. Maybe you've had an opportunity. I thought it was a beautiful illustration in our August study watchtower. Maybe you see the depiction there with Jesus, and he's conferring with those of the anointing that have already been resurrected, and the angelic forces, and they're looking down upon this physical earth. And the point is made that that's what's happening right now. This is a reality that's going on behind us. Bible prophecy thus clearly establishes that we're living in the last stage of the system of things. So again, if you had lived in the first century, I know and hope that you would have acted accordingly. As the scriptures tell us, you wouldn't have come down from the housetop. You would have fled, regardless of the changes you had to leave behind. In that sense, we fled out of this system of things today. But what else can we do? We have to realize that we have to take action. Action is required to survive any kind of calamity. Living here in the Mobile area, I've come to appreciate that it seems like every hurricane that's coming this way is either coming up the coast or it's coming right toward Mobile Bay. And we scramble and we prepare, regardless of whether we've lived through one or regardless of whether it's a 1, 2, 3, or 4. We're taking action that we can, what we can do. But despite this proof, so many people just ridicule it. I've lived through them before. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not leaving my home. That's the same attitude many had back in the first century. And we can't afford to have that attitude today in this system. You see, it's absolutely essential that you and I show by our godly conduct and by our devotion that we realize that we're living deep in Satan's system of things, and our lives show that. Let's take a look at 2 Peter 3, 11 and 12. It really tells us that since we're privileged to have this knowledge and be Jehovah's people and be taught by him, the kind of people that we should be. 2 Peter 3, and let's look at 11 and 12 together. It says, since all these things are to be dissolved in this way, consider what sort of people you ought to be in holy acts of conduct and deeds of godly devotion, as you await and keep close in mind the presence of the day of Jehovah, through which the heavens will be destroyed in flames and the elements will melt in the intense heat. Did you notice there it said, what sort of people, what sort of person should you and I be? In holy acts of conduct and deeds of devotion. Yes, these are actions words. This shows the kind of person that we really need to be in this time of the end. So we really need to ask ourselves some soul-searching questions. Am I zealous in preaching and teaching? Really knowing and believing that these are the last days? It's been a challenge over the past 3 or 4 months, hasn't it? We got so used to being able to go out and door-to-door witnessing, public witnessing, the cart witnessing. And at first, I don't know about you, but I was like, I don't know about this letter writing. I don't know about this phone witnessing. This is just a big change. I don't know if I can do that or not. And then all you've got to do is talk to some of the brothers and sisters. You talk to some of these older brothers and sisters and what they've been doing. You see others in other countries that would give anything to be able to sit down at a computer and be able to phone people, be able to write letters, and they can't. They would love to, but they can't. So are we really making these changes that we have to? You see, does this reality that we're living in the last days, does it really affect my daily life? The plans that I'm making, what my goals are? Is it evident in my lifestyle, the choices that I make right now? Not that others are judging us, but is it evident that we really know that we're living in the last days and not trying to eke out a position or possessions in this whole system of things? It's really interesting when you've been around Jehovah's organization for a long time. I don't want to use the term take it for granted, but sometimes these accounts, they don't really impact us the way that it does sometimes when someone's just come into the truth. Their eyes are open. I'd like to share an experience with you of a young man, an older man, excuse me. He'd been in the military his entire life. And yet, as soon as he retired, he started studying with the witness. He was fascinated with the Bible and with Bible history. And this gentleman was a quartermaster in the military. That's where he spent his career. Now, I don't know if you know what a quartermaster is, But the quartermaster is responsible for outfitting the soldiers, whether they're a company or a battalion or whatever the case may be. And he's got to very, very carefully sit down and account for their water, their food, their clothing, vehicles they would need, weapons, ammunition. He's got to calculate this. And maybe it's for 500, maybe it's for 5,000 that are going on one of these trainings. They're going to be miles out where they can't get anything. So he's got to be very careful. Well, when his Bible teacher started talking to him about the nation of Israel that we're studying right now in our Christian life and ministry, he was fascinated. As soon as his Bible teacher told him there were probably over 3.5 million people that went out into the wilderness, he couldn't fathom that. How in the world would you make those arrangements? So he sat down with some of his calculations and he said, you know, to feed that many people, it would take 1,500 tons of food every day to feed them. The Bible teacher said, yes, I know that. He said, and they'd have to have something to cook. They didn't have cooking ovens and things like we do. He said, you'd have to have wood. He said, that'd take 4,000 tons of wood every day just for them to cook. He said, yeah, I know that. He said, and you'd have to have water. You got to have water to live. He said, it would take 11 million gallons of water just to have a little to drink and to wash on. 11 million gallons every day. Yeah, I know that. And then he mentioned something. He said, and do you realize when they had to pitch camp, it would take an area 2/3 the size of the entire state of Rhode Island for them to camp on? Yeah, I know that. And then he mentioned something that to me was just fascinating, because you've probably seen some of the movies that were put together, and it shows the parting of the Red Sea, you know, and we see those walls apart, don't we? But this man said, did you know that if they went through two abreast, it would take them 35 days to go through? And they made it through in one night. He said, do you realize what that means? He said, that means that you'd have to have 5,000 abreast. You'd have to stand here, look, 3 miles away. That's how far that water was apart. That's amazing. And his Bible teacher said, boy, you've done a lot of work, haven't you? And the Bible teacher asked him, he said, do you think Moses and Aaron sat down and figured all that out before they went out in the wilderness? And the man shook his head. He said, no. He said, they trusted in Jehovah. And that's what we have to do. So, you know, you get somebody new like that, and it makes a profound effect. It encourages us to really dig deep, to make these things come alive, to examine those numbers, so to speak. Then it becomes real, and we see Jehovah's hand in matters. We see how he protected them and saved them, and how likewise Jehovah's going to preserve us alive. Just something for us to think about, isn't it? You see, when we discuss material such as this, and we see what our brothers and sisters are going through worldwide, it really helps us to appreciate that what we really are, what really counts is what's in our hearts. It has nothing to do with what this world might think of us. It's what Jehovah thinks of us. You and I have come to appreciate that it's what we can really give. It's not what we can get that we're focused on. We're not trying to store up treasures in the heavens. I think even people in the world today, regardless of how much they've had, and I've been dealing with some doctors in my past business, and they're all worried about their retirement accounts and how much they've dropped. And, you know, it just overnight, and you want to shake your head and go, I've been trying to tell you that for years. We think about that we can be content with a little when we see what our brothers and sisters are going through and how they're viewing things. Maybe you saw in that recent number 5, that sister said, I didn't even see the bars on the walls. That wasn't what I was focusing on. What a beautiful example of faith. You know, we think back to many of these other Bible accounts. I think about that rich young ruler. He had many things. And the Pharisees, they appeared holy, and they had the law, and they had sharp minds. But that young ruler, he wasn't happy. And the Pharisees, they were anything but holy. So today, again, not being negative, we see every aspect of this whole system of things. The air, the food, physically, emotionally, financially, politically. It's at an all-time low, and it's getting worse. And that's part of the things that people are so fearful of. But yet the fear that we have is our fear of Jehovah. So we don't say this to be negative. We're just being realistic that, again, we're in the last of the last days. So we raised 2 very thoughtful and sobering questions as we began our discussion, didn't we? We asked what we could practically do to prepare and position ourselves for survival. Well, we've seen what those did in the first century. They were willing to make adjustments. They were willing to be content. They were willing to make whatever changes necessary to preserve their lives. They acted on faith, and they were obedient. So our second question, how does our trust in Jehovah apply now and in our future? Well, these things have to be real to us. We have to be able to recall these things. Scripturally, we think about these accounts. It means so very much to us when we see how our brothers and sisters are remaining faithful. And we know that such ones survived back then in the first century. We know that Jehovah, as we mentioned, Jehovah cares about life. He doesn't wish for any to be destroyed. If we share that same viewpoint right now, our focus is going to be how we can help others, how we can bring the truth to them, how we can bring comfort to them, because that's part of our responsibility, being one of Jehovah's Witnesses, that we have this precious truth to share with others. You know, today, you and I have spent some time looking back, and it's good to go back and review these things. We see how even in the most trying and critical times, those that listened and learned and acted obediently in their faith, they survived circumstances that were beyond their human understanding. There is no way, if you lived in Jerusalem and you looked out over those walls and you were surrounded by the Roman armies, that you ever thought there was any way to escape. Jehovah made the way of escape. And that's what we sang in our song, that we seek Jehovah if we want to survive into the system of things. That's the only way. They acted and they lived. Likewise, today, we're acting in good accordance with the things we're being taught. So despite this pandemic and the other things that are befalling us, all of Jehovah's people today are still happy to try to assist those by means of free home Bible studies, even over Zoom at these most trying times. How about those of us that have been serving Jehovah for years? Well, it's imperative that we keep alert, that we not get weighed down, not preoccupied with the cares of this daily life. We've seen so much of that depicted in our recent regional convention. The young man tested with his secular work. Those problems can weigh upon us, especially now with the economic impact that is going to come and has come to so many of our brothers and sisters. But we are not overly occupied. We remember at the Sermon on the Mount, 4 times, what did Jesus tell his closest followers within about 15 minutes? Stop being anxious about these things. Jehovah will take care of us. As we talked about our Bible student, Jehovah took care of them, he'll take care of us. So now is the time to remain steadfast, not to look back, but to keep alert. Let's take a look at 2 Peter 3:14. It's 2 Peter, and we'll look at the 14th verse of chapter 3. Therefore, beloved ones, since you're awaiting these things, do your utmost to be found finally by him spotless and unblemished and in peace. So although we've looked back at history, now we want to look forward. We want to be like Moses. We want to see the one who's invisible, and we know that the greater Moses is leading us to a promised new world and a paradise. So now let us look forward and keep in mind the words found at our closing scripture, 2 Corinthians 4:16 and 18. That's 2 Corinthians 4, and we'll consider verses 16 and 18. Therefore, we do not give up, but even if the man we are outside is wasting away, certainly the man we are inside is being renewed from day to day. While we keep our eyes not on the things seen, but on the things unseen. For the things seen are temporary, but the things unseen are everlasting. So if we continue together on this way, we'll soon see his kingdom come and his will be done right here on this earth. Very soon our hopes will be realized and all our dreams and desires will come true because we together will be survivors of these last days. Thank you.